Hello, you are listening to Secret Art of Spacetime, a podcast about ideas, culture, and politics from an esoteric lens. My name is Andy, and I'll be your host. To receive extended episodes and support the show in the process, click the link in the show notes to subscribe. Enjoy the episode. Hello. So I want to keep on with this theme of trying to make sense of this moment we're in time, in a historical context. And today I want to talk about paradigms and paradigm shifts and see if it might be helpful to frame our moment in time as a massive paradigm shift. So the idea of paradigm shifts, the way that, the word paradigm is used, comes from Thomas Kuhn, who was a physicist who became a historian of physics, and then a philosopher. And he wrote a really important book called The Structure of Scientific Revolution, which I think was published in the late 50s. So I just looked it up. It was actually 1962 that it was published. And in this book, he analyzes the history of physics and the way in which the overarching structure or picture, in a way, or paradigm, in which scientists made sense of the physics of their time goes through periodic, massive structural changes, right? Or revolutions. So revolution, because the changes to the paradigm were not gradual or small, but all-encompassing, right? Like the difference between Newtonian physics and, physics post Einsteinian relativity isn't just, a few small changes. It's a totally different picture of how the world operates. But importantly, the relativity paradigm includes the Newtonian one. Like, there is a way to make sense of Newtonian physics within relativity, right? It's seen as basically a special case, right, where certain variables are constant, then Newtonian physics does make sense. So the new physics doesn't really replace the old one, but it makes sense of it in a broader context, in a context that explains more. So one of the things that's so interesting about Kuhn's analysis is that he observes that this shift between paradigms isn't quite a rational procedure. It's not like, physicists can see there are issues or limitations with our current model. We need a new one. Rather, what happens is there's an accumulation of anomalies. So like experimental data that defies the current framework. And at first the anomalies are ignored, right? Because accidents happen, random things happen, we can't explain everything. So we can't just throw out our understanding of the world because of a few anomalies. But over time, more and more and more anomalies accrue. And what happens, according to Kuhn, is that it's very, very rare for any one scientist to be able to do away with the paradigm that they've been working within. What's much more common is that a new generation of physicists comes along and adopts a radically different paradigm. Psychologically, it's really difficult to alter the way in which we see the world, the paradigm in which we're operating, because it is our world, right? So I'm kind of making the link now to worldview, which Kuhn doesn't really talk about, but I think we can see worldview in a similar context. And we can think about the history of the evolution of worldview, and the current dominant worldview in the West is what we could call reductive materialism, right? The view that reality is made of stuff, of matter, and the matter is interacting according to scientific laws to create all that we observe, to create reality. So reality is fundamentally sort of lifeless, and then life is almost an accident that arises according to chance. And this worldview is, in my view, intimately tied to commodification, extraction, exploitation, because those depend on a framework that sees reality itself as material, as lifeless, as there for the taking, as available for our manipulation, our control. There were these experiments done with chess players looking at perception, and the experiments found that experienced chess players actually perceive the chessboard in a fundamentally different way from novice players. They do what's called chunking. They'll see a pattern rather than individual pieces. So they see the board according to like moves and the connection between different pieces rather than, simply each individual piece. And have you ever, experienced learning something, and at some point there's a shift where the way you see the thing changes so that you start to be able to see more of the overall structure? Like with this chess example, surely there's some point where as you're learning chess, the patterns start to sort of coalesce in your mind where you can see it differently. And I think paradigms are a little bit similar, especially on like a cultural or collective level, where it's like as we experience more of reality, you could even say, or different aspects of reality with more depth and detail. And, on a collective level, this includes, of course, all the work of scientists and other specialists, and a new structure begins to emerge. And I think we are in this sort of quite long, right? Because we're talking about shifts that occur over the course of decades or sometimes even centuries, right? So I think we're in this period of kind of being between paradigms, or, where many people are in the previous paradigm, some people are in perhaps a new paradigm, and a lot of us are sort of in this in-between place where there's a lot of uncertainty and confusion, and that's manifesting in all kinds of ways. Like, I do think this is connected to politics and, the state of the world, basically. There's a lot of instability and uncertainty, and that's showing up in material ways, in political ways, as well as psychological and philosophical ways, as well as spiritual ways, right? So we spoke about the fractal nature of reality in a previous episode, right? Usually these patterns are similar on multiple levels. And what's interesting when we consider the dominant framework, I think it's actually still mostly modern philosophically. Like this sort of scientistic, quote unquote, liberal democracy, let's say, basically also imperialist worldview, I think it's still modern. Like, I think it's actually philosophically more connected to Newtonian physics and hasn't even integrated the paradigm shift to quantum theory, which, I mean, fair enough, right? Like, so many of the scientists who were studying quantum physics in earlier decades would say things like, if you think you understand it, you don't, right? Like, quantum physics notoriously is very challenging to understand, especially, of course, if we're steeped in a worldview that has not yet absorbed quantum physics, right? So it's going to be especially challenging if we're kind of still in the old paradigm, of course. And like, there can be a scientist who's working on quantum physics, but who's still basically, in their regular everyday life, still operating in a previous paradigm. So Kuhn didn't talk about this, but I think there's a connection between the scientific paradigm in a culture and the worldview of that culture. And I don't think ours has fully caught up to science. And strangely enough, even a lot of science hasn't fully caught up to the science, right? Like, a lot of science is still operating in this very kind of reductive, materialist, determinist kind of way. And it's certainly not just science, of course, that impacts worldview. And science itself, of course, operates within a wider context, a cultural context, and of course is going to be influenced by that as well. So I think on, let's say, like a philosophical, cultural level, the way I see it, and I hope it's clear that I don't see myself as an expert on any of these things. I'm just someone who loves ideas and thinking, and I love to play with ideas, and I especially love finding the connection between different ideas and different ways of thinking and different areas of thought. So I'm approaching all of this playfully and lightheartedly, and I do also very much welcome feedback, comments, questions, corrections. So please do let me know, right? Because I'm saying this now because I'm about to talk about something that I'm quite aware I'm very far from an expert on. But I find it helpful, and maybe some of you will as well. So the way I see it is that postmodernity was basically representative of the breakdown of modernity, right? So the recognition that the modern naturalistic, maybe, scientistic, reductive worldview could no longer hold sway. And postmodernity, to me, feels like a grappling with the uncertainty in between paradigms. And I know that a lot of people would not see it that way, because for a lot of people, the takeaways, let's say, of postmodernity have more to do with like a sort of non-structuralist approach to reality, we could say, or like a non-essentialist approach to reality as well. Like this idea that we have these frameworks and ways of thinking and understanding, and they're useful, and they may be culturally or socially valid, and they help us do things, but they're not like fundamentally true. And there are no fundamental truths, really. And of course, that's usually also the main critique of postmodernity, right? It really scares people, this idea that there's no fundamental truth, moral relativity, right? Like that's a really scary for a lot of people, and that's often the main criticism. But for me to suggest that postmodernity represents like a breakdown in between paradigms suggests that there may be some kind of truth post that. And it's not really that I think the new thing is like fundamentally true, although I do think there are some fundamental truths. But I also think we have to accept that knowledge is contextual and socially constructed in a lot of cases, which doesn't make it not true. Like there are important takeaways from postmodernity, right? But what am I trying to say? The new thing, like if we think of this model of paradigms as like a frame for making sense of things, it doesn't mean that it's true or not true. Like Newtonian physics isn't false just because now we see it in a broader context and we understand that Newtonian physics is like a special case, right? So, okay, maybe it wasn't like 100% the truth, but there's definitely still truth to it, right? Like those equations still work in certain cases. So it's not to say a previous paradigm is false. And it's not to say the new paradigm is true, right? Because in this model, we have to recognize that we keep evolving, right? This is not the end of history, right? We're not going to figure it all out and come to some static understanding of the world, right? I mean, that would be boring, but also that kind of embeds a sort of almost like totalitarian way of thinking, like to think that we have arrived at the final truth. But that's also not to say we ought to give up trying to make sense of the world or understanding things. Perhaps it's simply about adopting humility, right? So there's the level of science, there's the level of philosophy, and there's also the political, societal level, maybe we could call it. And like as globalization, let's say, has sort of played out and there's been more and more dialogue between different cultures and more of a recognition of the harms of imperialism and colonialism over, centuries, right? There's also a need to recognize the, we could say, Eurocentrism or like Western-centric, but also importantly, like imperial nature of modernity and particular ways of thinking. Right? Like decolonization must include our ways of thinking. to change political policy isn't enough. There are so many examples where attempted solutions to problems just embed the same problem, right? This is something that Bayo Akomolafe talks about. He puts it, I'm paraphrasing, but it's something like, what if the solution to the problem is part of the problem? And I can't help, I'm trying to think of an example that's not so controversial, but the example that comes to mind is like attempts at anti-racism that embed racism, basically, like where there's this like hyperfixation on race and difference, and like this inclination to like count and categorize people in groups and like, make sure there's like the right number of people from different racial categories. And this is not to say that anti-racism isn't important, right? It's not that. It's to notice how sometimes our proposed solutions aren't actually solutions, because the problem runs deeper than the external actions. It's part of psychology. So to make real change requires that we go deeper than politics, or that politics emerges from inner change. And there was an episode about this on the podcast Fucking Canceled, where they talk about this sort of approach or attempt at anti-racism that ends up basically reifying race. So my point is that as over time there's more and more dialogue between different people from different contexts, different perspectives, different backgrounds, different cultures, there's more and more of a recognition that we can't just impose our own perspective on the rest of the world, right? That is violent. So there's an inherent violence in this continuing politics of exporting a scientistic, quote-unquote, liberal democracy to the rest of the world. And even when it's not exported, that's still embedded, right, within it. I hope this is making sense. So decolonization requires us to take seriously other ways of knowing, not just to learn about them like as curiosities and to see them as untrue, right? Like, oh, isn't that quaint? That culture has this spiritual belief. Cute. No. To really take seriously that there are fundamentally different ways of seeing the world and of being in the world. And when we do that, it becomes clear that the dominant framework, right, what I'm imperfectly calling reductive materialism or sometimes modernity, and I'm not against democracy, just to be clear, okay? But it's this model, right, like American imperialism, which is clearly breaking down right now, right? And when we take seriously other ways of knowing, it becomes quite striking that this dominant framework is by far the anomaly. There's no single other culture or philosophy that I know of that is materialist, that believes reality is fundamentally lifeless, dead, random particles, that humans are nothing more than accidents, that consciousness is incidental. Nearly every other culture is what anthropologists have called animist, right? Most cultures on Earth believe that reality fundamentally is made of beings, not of stuff. And it's important to be critical, too, of the concept of animism, right? Which comes from this biased perspective, right? It comes from a Eurocentric perspective that's looking out at other cultures and categorizing them. So even the concept of animism is problematic, right? But it's still perhaps useful. And, you know, we can be critical of something and still use it, right? Because it's the best we've got. So not only are most cultures animist, but our own historical cultures, whatever they might be, are mostly animist, right? If we go far enough back in our own ancestry, most of our ancestors were what we could call animist. So materialism is the anomaly. And if animism is fundamentally spiritual, right? If we take spirituality as a belief in spirits, right? Being souls, or the idea that reality is full of beings, many of which are unseen, then spirituality, we could say, is also the norm. And a non-spiritual perspective is anomalous. And for this reason, I actually really don't like the word spirituality. I use it sometimes because it's useful, but the word itself implies that spirituality is some special thing that's distinct from maybe a more normal or ordinary way of seeing the world, right? Spirituality always implies non-spirituality. And it kind of also embeds this idea that spirituality is like some special thing, or some like a personal choice, a personal belief. It's something we do, you know, in our private life, whereas our communal life is non-spiritual, because spirituality is our own sort of personal beliefs, right? It's also sort of seen as very belief-based and not about reality. But the thing is, when you start working spiritually, when you start interacting with the world in that way, it becomes just as real as anything else. Like when you have conversations with beings, right? When you have very real, visceral experiences that, you know, we might call spiritual, it becomes a part of your reality. It is real, just as real as anything else. And this is where I might differ from someone who is perhaps more in a postmodern mindset, because to me and to a lot of people, an animist framework, let's say, is true. Like, beings exist. It's not like a fun framework to play with. It's reality. And like, I say this even in the context of this conversation of paradigms and the recognition that, you know, paradigms will continue to shift and thinking will continue to evolve. But, you know, if we can sort of zoom out and see modernity truly as an historical anomaly, then perhaps even within an animist framework, paradigms can continue to evolve, right? Because we can think of all kinds of different paradigms that are themselves animist, right? Different cultures, different spiritual traditions may be seen as different paradigms, but all operating within an animist frame or world. So, if there's some new paradigm emerging, I don't think it's like simply animism. I think it's going to be much more sort of specific and flavored in a way, like according to time and place. And I also think maybe we should be wary of the idea of sort of one new big paradigm, because I think part of this sort of long, slow transformation we're undergoing is the recognition that the idea that there could be some sort of vast overarching system is itself part of the problem, right? It's sort of embeds totalitarianism, right? The idea that there could be or should be some one ultimate system that everyone adopts, right? Aren't we moving beyond systemic thought in that way? Isn't that also what postmodernity was about? That said, it does feel like there is something emerging. Perhaps as long as we keep the awareness that it's never going to be some fundamental truth, we shouldn't impose it on other people. And yet there's usefulness in, operating within some shared perspective, right? Because it allows for communication and it allows for collaboration. It allows for new developments, new ideas, new technologies, right? So it's helpful, it's useful when there's a shared community operating with a shared perspective. And it certainly feels to me, and I think to a lot of people, like something is emerging, right? Even though we're in this period of perhaps chaos and confusion, especially externally, there are yet many people who are and have been working to create something different, something new. And as time goes on, it feels more and more like there's something emergent, right? Some sort of new structure that is emerging that is often called spiritual, but I think it feels a little bit problematic almost to call it spiritual, because it feels like that then excludes people who don't see themselves as spiritual, or it feels like it's some kind of special interest thing. Whereas, right, if we understand that what's spiritual is actually quite natural to the way humans think and operate, if we understand materialism as the anomaly, then it's not even really spiritual at all. It just is a new framework, a new philosophy, a new worldview, a new paradigm. One that perhaps can be respectful of other cultures. And by respectful, I don't just mean like not harmful to, but like actually open to and learning from. And that, of course, is already happening and has been already happening. And there's an important difference, right, between appropriation and what a lot of people are calling appreciation, right? So avoiding cultural appropriation does not mean avoiding other cultures, right? It does not mean turning away from conversation and learning, because that is equally disrespectful, right? Like, here's another example of the extreme polarities actually encompassing an underlying unity. Cultural appropriation as one extreme versus turning away from other cultures altogether as the other extreme are both disrespectful, right? What's needed is real, genuine respect, curiosity, openness, humility, and the willingness to learn. And while, of course, So many things could be said about the features of what feels like this emergent paradigm. I think if we see it as fundamentally animist, that in itself could create such incredible, beautiful change in the practical world, right? In our lived experience, in political realities. Because if culturally it's acknowledged that reality is fundamentally made of beings, of life, of souls, then I believe it would be much, much more difficult to justify a culture that is based on extraction and exploitation and the degradation of Earth and other humans and other creatures. It's not to say there will be no problems or no harm or no trauma or no violence. Like, all of those things may still exist, but I think on a totally different scale. Like, right now, I see the root of what some people call the polycrisis as, it's like our world is right now kind of operating on violence, on extraction. You can still hurt another being if you're aware of it as being a being, as having a soul, but you will have to face that in a different way, right? The rest of this episode is available for paying subscribers who quite literally make this show possible. Click the link in the show notes to subscribe and support the show. Other ways to support the show include subscribing in your podcast feed, leaving a 5-star review, and sharing the show with others who might enjoy it. Thank you so much, everyone, for listening. Until next time, goodbye.